Hi. Okay, so I think we're live. Everybody wave and say hi. We have quite an audience joining us today, this afternoon. And I want to say thank you to everybody who has joined us. We're going to give a couple of minutes to make sure that people check in and maybe get comfortable and maybe get a drink of water so that we can have a nice conversation. Just in terms of general logistics of this, we are going to have the four of us doing some speaking and some question and answer. We're not going to be able to hear any audience participants, and we're not going to be able to activate the raise hand function that sometimes comes with a Zoom-based webinar. Instead, we encourage people who haven't had a chance to already submit their questions in advance, and thank you to those of you who have. To just submit questions in the Q&A section of the seminar. So let's see, we have a nice group. We have about 50% already on. We're going to give it another minute or so, although we will definitely end on time. So we're not going to run late just because we're giving some people a chance to log on. We will definitely respect everybody's time. So thank you. Yeah, thank you guys for joining us.
Excited to be here.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Karina.
Yeah, this was sort of a labor of love. I'm kind of amazed that we have enough people from such different disciplines that wanted to talk about this one shared topic, and that we had so many people who are from our different circles of life professionally who actually were interested in joining in this topic. I know there's been a lot of content put out that's very technical and very compliance oriented, and we've put out a lot of that content, and I guess we're not surprised when we have a lot of interest in free compliance content, but it's always so heartwarming to see people really interested in something that's in a different category from compliance. So I'm very encouraged. I'm very encouraged and I'm very excited, and I'm hoping we're going to generate some questions. So I want to welcome everybody. Everybody who's on the call listening, and my esteemed panelists. I get the easy work. I get to tee up the questions for you guys. I'm doing the interview here, and you guys are going to do some deep dives into talking within your areas of expertise. So I want to start by addressing a question to Ben, because in a sense, a concept that you had is what gave rise to the idea for this webinar. So Ben, tell us a little bit about what you do, your professional background, and what was the inspiration for this webinar, and what was the inspiration for what led to this webinar?
Happy to do so. So my name is Ben Helfman, and I'm a corporate attorney at Greenberg Glusker. My responsibilities kind of fall within three buckets. One is doing traditional mergers and acquisitions. One is doing venture financings, both representing investors as well as companies who are receiving the funding. And the third is serving as outside general counsel to several clients, ranging from restaurant, food and beverage space to cannabis, to retail and tech. And as far as what was the inspiration for In Good Company and then this webinar, COVID hit, the world instantly changed. And we were sending out legal updates about the family's first Coronavirus Response Act, about the CARES Act and the impact on the PPP on some of our clients and potential clients, but we didn't really feel like that was enough. And there were a couple of reasons that we decided to create In Good Company. One is that we were shook as a firm, and we really wanted to shine a light in a time of darkness. The other was that having that technical info and knowing how to comply is one thing, but it doesn't paint the whole picture. It really is incomplete. And without having more context about how companies are responding in real time, it really couldn't show our clients how they can also rise to the occasion. Since we started In Good Company, which for those who don't know, it's a newsletter that we started sending 7 or 8 weeks ago. And we just started showcasing 4 or 5 clients per newsletter as well as some friends of the firm in the community. We really focused on Southern California because while we have clients nationwide, as a single office firm that's based in SoCal and a full service firm, we really feel drawn to being and servicing the greater Los Angeles and Southern California community. And since we launched this newsletter, it's really taken on a life of its own. It's grown organically. We've had people submitting stories, both people who've received the newsletter themselves, as well as people who have been forwarded the newsletter by their own contacts. And just to end the final question, on a selfish note, it's made my day better every day because some of my days are spent looking at how companies have been responding positively and rising to the occasion and pivoting in really productive ways for society.
I think it's really fascinating to hear that it took on a life of its own, that it wasn't something that was being prescribed to anybody. It wasn't something that was tied to, here's how you get more money, or here's how you get this additional external benefit. It was something that, it sounds like, really generated a lot of natural organic interest because companies were really drawn to doing something that was from a corporate responsibility side rather than just a corporate fiscal side. And actually, to that point, I want to pivot to Emily because you're an expert on CSR, which I think stands for corporate social responsibility. You'll tell us what that is, but tell us first a little bit about your background, because I think it's fascinating, and how you would describe the CSR social impact landscape before COVID. Like, how did we get here with respect to what CSR was?
Absolutely. So thank you for having me. I am a regulatory lawyer by training and went to law school to make California a better place. I didn't even know how to spell CSR when I started law school. And through a course of events, had an opportunity to work at a place called The Wonderful Company in the legal department. And because I had always...
company, yeah? A tiny little nothing, yeah.
You may have heard of the pistachios, the almonds, the pomegranates, and it's a privately held company. And the owners of this company, especially in the last decade, said, we want to take the value that we've created as an organization and really think about giving back, which for me was why it was a perfect fit for my, at the time, young law career. And started with the CSR, Corporate Social Responsibility Department, as a client, and then ultimately took over as the head of the foundation, running all of the giving for the family and for the business, and did kind of everything under the sun from a CSR, employee engagement, volunteerism, cause marketing, and large family foundation gifts, and really learned firsthand that social impact, when it's leader-led and when it's measured and managed, can be super impactful. I also learned that when you don't have that piece, you don't have leaders paying attention, and you don't have measurement and management, that CSR, unfortunately, can be an afterthought and not really move the needle. And so when I started my firm, Ethos Giving, after serving for almost a decade at Wonderful, I really wanted to bring this like powerful muscle to the masses and help folks do social impact on steroids, as we call it. So the first question, before we talk about social impact on steroids, what is CSR? So you nailed it. Corporate social responsibility is a term that was coined in 1953 by an economist named Howard Bowen, who wrote a book called The Social Responsibilities of the Businessman. And in that book, he really set out, and it was, coming out of the two world wars, major economic pain for certainly the United States, moving into the Cold War, and really thinking about how can business be a power for good? What does it look like for business to have a responsibility? And in this book, he really outlined in great detail what a business organization could do to drive community betterment, also to the benefit of that business's bottom line. Unfortunately, just to get like very, quick about it, I think folks took the title and coined that term CSR in the 1950s, but didn't follow Bowen's structure and rigor when it came to what that work actually looked like. So before COVID, CSR meant a ton of different things to, pick your organization. They could define it exclusively in and of themselves. There's no professional degree related to CSR that's nationalized. There's no standardized test that you need to take to be a professional in this work. There is no national audit model. There's no regulatory requirements. So it's really broad, which means that it can be as amazing or as mediocre as the leadership requires. And, so coming into COVID, I think we were just starting to see a renaissance and evolution in this work. You had, places like the Business Roundtable and Davos saying social impact matters. We're drawing a line in the sand. You had people like Larry Fink, pen in his, eponymous letter that social impact matters and that they were only going to financially back companies that were really starting to do this work well. So people right before COVID were just thinking about how to bake CSR into their work, and then COVID happened. And we'll talk more about that, but it, I think, really accelerated the field 20-fold.
So Ben, COVID happened, and kind of switching to companies engaged in, I guess we can call it like doing good, but really engaged in CSR during COVID. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like in the time of COVID for a business to do good when they're really kind of freaking out about their bottom line and whether they're even going to be viable at the end of this, but still managing to squeeze in doing good? Maybe you have some examples from the In Good Company newsletter.
Sure. So to begin with, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all model. It really depends on the industry, the specific company, the company's resources. And it's worth noting that resources aren't necessary in order to do good, right? So doing good can just mean being more transparent with your employees during a very uncertain time, and providing access to management, having direct Q&As with management to really alleviate some of the concerns that employees may feel when so many people are being laid off or furloughed or having their salaries cut. But from some direct examples of what some of our clients have done and some of the companies we've showcased in the newsletter, Sugarfish came out and right off the bat guaranteed the employment of all of their employees. Obviously, for those who don't know, Sugarfish is a local sushi restaurant, a family of sushi restaurants, as well as some other restaurants in the SoCal area, as well as in New York City. And some of those employees have had to transition roles from maybe serving within the restaurant to providing curbside delivery and even serving as delivery drivers. But they really found creative solutions to ensure that they would guarantee employment for everybody. They've also agreed to donate food to a lot of hospitals in the SoCal area. Similarly, Brooke Williamson and Playa Provisions teamed up with World Central Kitchen, which is Jose Andres' nonprofit. And they've done an incredible job of serving the front lines. And then we have a lot of retail clients such as Show Me Your Moo, who've come out and kind of pivoted and scaled up production of masks and have been donating a percentage of those masks, some of them to healthcare workers, some of them to prisoners and other vulnerable populations. And just the response that we've seen has really been amazing.
Yeah. And to your point, I actually think it's really important to point out, because we did have some questions in advance from some of the attendees of the webinar right now. What do we do if we don't have extra cash reserves to contribute to CSR-oriented activities? And I think it's really important to remind all of us that there are a lot of creative ways that companies can do good. It all depends on your resources, what you have available. But even if you have no resources at all from your perspective, I know from my experience working with clients, I do employment law and I advise companies of all sizes. They're predominantly privately held companies, so they're considered smaller to mid-sized companies. They're really trying to figure things out right now, but they've done some pretty incredible things that have cost very little money or even no money. Everything from really assuring job security or transitioning or retraining for job continuity, things that are investing inwards, to allowing their employees to fundraise in a way that reaches out and then to aggregate and pool the results and then contribute that to a cause that they really support and really believe in and want to give to. There maybe give employees an extra 2 hours a day or an extra 5 hours a week to devote to something that is outside of the regular business stream. So it doesn't cost them anything extra. There isn't a ton of work that companies are doing right now for the most part. And it's been a tremendous opportunity to get very creative and build relationships internally that do result in the doing good for the community. So I really love that you pointed that out. And I think it's really important that when we talk about business takes the form of so many different avenues. I actually wanted to pivot to you, Nate, because you have a very interesting segue into the business world. You didn't come out kind of like a newbie right into the business world. You had a very, very fascinating path. So do us a favor, tell us a little bit about your trajectory and then what your company Miller Inc. does now. And really, what is the difference between the different types of communications? Because we know it's a communications company, but give us a little bit of real depth into how you got there and what those words mean.
Sure. Well, first of all, we really want to thank you for having us on this webinar. And it's so great to be able to chat about this issue, which I really think is the most important issue in many ways for so many businesses at this moment. My background is in sort of public policy and politics. I spent a number of years after I got my graduate degree in public policy working in think tanks, and then as a speechwriter, most recently as the speechwriter for the Israeli mission to the United Nations. And during that time, I also worked at public relations agencies, sort of where comms meets policy. And I moved back to LA in 2013, where I grew up, and founded our agency to really develop a new model for how I see strategic communications. And I think we had a vision for where the industry was going, and it's definitely proven, proven out. So we work sort of at the intersection of earned, owned, and paid media. And what we like to think about how we bring together all the different communications tools that exist in the world today, whether that's digital, whether that's earned media securing an article in the paper, or paid media advertising, and bringing them together into integrated strategies. We're headquartered here in Los Angeles. We have clients globally across a range of industries, from real estate and tech, government and nonprofit, to manufacturing. And I also have a fairly large crisis management practice through which we work with a lot of wonderful attorneys like yourself.
I can imagine.
I'm also married. I'm married to a lawyer, and I spend a lot of my days talking to lawyers. I feel like I'm sort of a lawyer by proxy at this point. So that's really what Miller Inc. does. And I would just add, I think the examples that were shared were so important. This is really a moment, I think, when you're thinking about communications, there's three real principles that we've tried to bring to the table with all of our work. And those are communicating with compassion, authenticity, and vision. Compassion meaning communicating in a way that you let both, whether that's an internal audience, people within your company, or an external audience, your customers, your stakeholders, your partners, an understanding that what they're going through, and that you're kind of acting in solidarity with them, and being open and transparent about understanding the challenges they face, and also understanding the challenges that you as a business maybe are facing. I think that's extremely important. The second is authenticity. Understanding what you as a business uniquely bring to this moment, and whether that's in your social impact strategy or your business strategy. And we could talk through a lot of different examples of folks who have done that well, but I think authenticity is extremely important. There's no business is the same as any other, and no nonprofit is the same as any other in this moment. Everybody has something unique to bring to the table. And it's really leaning into that thing that made you great before this crisis, looking around you, understanding where the needs are, and then figuring out how you fill those needs. And then the third thing is vision. Understanding, I think people are looking for leaders, for companies, for organizations that have a vision for what the future looks like, and figuring out where is your company going to pursue that vision? It could be a rough draft. Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball, but it's really important to begin, especially now as we're moving, into the sort of month 3, 4 of this crisis, to like think about where are we going 6 months from now, and how are you communicating that regularly in a compelling way to your audience?
Is that something that businesses can and should be doing on their own, or is that something that is typically done with you guys? Like, do you have any suggestions for how a business can start right now, even an exercise in authenticity?
Yeah. One thing that's really an incredible change we've seen in the environment, the communications environment, is sort of a democratization of communications. So, for many years, PR firms operated according to a gatekeeper model, where the greatest value you could bring to the table was the connections that you had to relationships to journalists, and then the journalists write the story. Today, everybody is a publisher. Everybody has a message that can be delivered directly to your audience through social media, through email marketing, through your website. And with that comes a tremendous opportunity. It also, it requires a different level of, I would say, skill and strategy in developing a message. You have to be very thoughtful in thinking about how do you set up the right kind of ecosystem to deliver that message. And that's certainly something we do. We think about 360 degrees, how do you set up an organization for success so that their earned media strategy is integrated with what they're doing on their own media platforms across, website, email, social media, and then to make sure that their advertising strategy is also supporting those other objectives.
So in this COVID moment that we're in right now, understanding that we're trying to survive it, but also maybe plant some seeds for getting past it and growing eventually beyond it.
Yeah.
Can you give us a concrete, maybe action item that a business can take, sort of one for an internal communication and one that's an external communication that is either an example that's already been deployed that you're aware of, or just something you think is really applicable to most businesses?
Sure. Well, let me say this. The laws of the universe no longer apply in this moment. It's been fascinating for me to watch. Laws apply. Laws apply. Don't listen. That's what I love. That's why I'm a communications guy. What can I say? It's really true. In March, we have 40 plus clients. We were rewriting the playbook for virtually every single one of them. My team worked very hard. I'm really proud of the work that we've been able to do to kind of reorient everybody for this moment. There's so many different, I think the key to success in this moment is to be listening, to be evaluating, to be reevaluating, and to be planning and thinking 6 steps ahead. And there's no model that exists that is sacred any longer. Everything is on the table, and you have to be open-minded and you have to be nimble. I've seen so many organizations seize the opportunities inherent in this moment. We have a university client that has overnight, within a week, had completely transferred their community public education program online and built a robust webinar series that's regularly attracting thousands and thousands of people, that's bringing life to folks who are at home who weren't necessarily within their core group before, and is building a new audience for them as future customers, donors, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's a good lifeline. We have an insurance client that has made a dramatic announcement, half off auto insurance for all essential workers.
Ooh.
Through 2020. And not only that, 25% off for life for essential workers. They say we need a new GI Bill that values essential workers. So it's a tremendous story and visionary. It took him kind of like the CEO stepping outside of his model and saying, can we do this? And like being able to think differently. And then obviously, so it's a tremendous value to the community, and it creates a tremendous communications opportunity. Sorry, I gave you 2, I know. From an internal communications perspective, I will say this. We've been partners in writing a lot of very difficult communications over the last 3 months. Really to communicate really challenging information. And I think that I think the key here is to treat people like adults and to treat them like you would like they are friends. The tone of your email has to be, the people receiving the email have to feel like there's a living, breathing human being on the other end of the line. And one thing I will say about lawyers and HR folks is sometimes there's like you have to have a balance between what you have to do from an HR perspective or a legal perspective and thinking about, can we give it that human touch? And oftentimes obviously we work very well and collaboratively work with our legal partners. But I think our job is to think through with them, how do we give this a sense of compassion and a sense of the folks on the other side, we can communicate with transparency and humanity, so people feel taken care of.
I think that's actually, and that's a theme that I think is coming out, both when we met ahead of the web to kind of connect and talk about where we wanted to focus. And even today, as we're talking, I've heard each one of you in one of your answers a real distinction between those in the know and those not in the know. And I think the real opportunity right now is this moment for transparency, choosing transparency intentionally, blending it with authenticity. It doesn't mean you have to disclose all your trade secrets. It doesn't have to mean you disclose things that make you vulnerable or dubious, but it does mean that you maybe give a little more information than it's the bare minimum that everybody needs to know. And you give them the information that from a empathetic, compassionate perspective, they would want to know. Like, this is meaningful for them to know. And I actually know from working with some of my clients' leadership has actually gone the next step and taken that platform not just into telling their employees, here's what you need to know, and here's what we think you may also want to know, but in addition to that, soliciting feedback from all levels of the company, meaning flattening the hierarchy and not just working with their C-suite team, like, what do we do, and what next? But soliciting feedback from everybody, from the mailroom to the receptionist in the front desk to the support staff, saying, what ideas are you hearing? What else do you think we could do? We're going to look into it. It doesn't mean we're going to implement every one of these things, but we certainly have the ability right now to evaluate all of those things and look into them and potentially incorporate them. And that, to me, is an aspect of CSR that's inward communications looking, that is likely to cost little to nothing and is a huge investment in current infrastructure and future-minded infrastructure. I think I actually wanted to ask Emily, because I think a lot of times we think of CSR as being very specific in response to a specific situation. So we can have a COVID moment, which sounds very medical and is very scientific. And so if you're thinking very much inside the box, you're thinking, well, that's really an opportunity for the pharma companies or whoever can sew masks. What about all the other companies that don't have this obvious entry point into leveraging their CSR role and their doing good capacity in this COVID moment? What do we say to all the other companies?
Yeah, so Edelman they do a trust index, and they put out a survey and got some information right when coronavirus hit. And in April, they came out with a study that said 90% of consumers said that businesses have a responsibility to work with government and the public sector to make sure that their employees and their communities stay safe. So 90% of businesses are not pharma and healthcare and, the kind of usual suspects. And the folks who have an ability because of what they sell or what their services are to do good right now and really dig into that, amazing. But first of all, we need more people to show up. The world is hurting right now. There is so much need. And so, everybody has to get a bucket and help. And number two, the court of public opinion is expecting you to. 90% of people didn't say, oh, if it fits your sector, then yes, but if not, no. It was very clear. And so the question is, okay, great. what does that mean for me? How do I do that? And we've talked a lot about today, you know, small businesses. So it's not to say, how big of a check can I write? I think the question really is, what do we do as an organization? How can we be of service right now? What does our geographic community need? And I think there's a sort of hierarchy. Number one, as a company, figuring out how you can best serve your employees right now. And that may just mean keeping people on payroll. And I don't mean that as a just thing. That is huge, you know, for keeping communities healthy and safe right now. Number two, if you have the ability to serve your neighborhood, your zip code, I think that's the next place to look. And if you are in a moment with your company where you can do more, thinking about your regional response. And, you know, for some folks who have the bandwidth and the resources, thinking about vaccines and more national macro efforts, amazing, but that's not where everybody needs to be. So, you know, there's a few brands that I think have really stood out to me in this kind of evaluation work, where the CEO took a second and said, okay, yesterday I did this, COVID happened, what can I do to be of service? And you saw a company like Reformation come out. They never made masks before COVID. They weren't a healthcare company.
They're a clothing company, right?
They're a clothing company in Los Angeles. And they said, we want to keep as many people employed as possible. And we know that folks need masks. And we're going to go to our suppliers and figure out the best materials that we can get at the best price, so we can put out cloth masks that are important for hospitals and important from a public health perspective to get folks out in the community wearing masks and have it feel cool and aesthetically pleasing. And they were one of the first folks out to do that. And I thought that was really impressive. And now, you know, 10 weeks out, they're thinking about how to coordinate patterns with outfits and, you know, really coming online with a new frontier, which is super cool. We have a client called Teeks, which is a ballet flat company, right? They make shoes. And the CEO, who's a client and a friend of ours, said, I feel called. Like, I feel like I need to figure out how to use our organization to help. And they have folks who have sewing abilities. They started making masks by the thousands, which was great. But he felt this itch that he could do more. And they've got over 1 million fans on Facebook, and the community is very active. And so he said, what if we put out a sewing pattern and activated our fan base, and they gave people $100 coupon for 50 masks sewn, and all you had to do was validate that you made the masks and that you donated them to first responders. And he thought maybe they would get 10,000, 100,000. They're now almost 1 million masks in, 800,000 masks have been made. And this is a campaign that totally changed his community of folks and activated them. And I think the thing that was the most kind of magic for me about his effort was that he gave people in the community something to do. And not every business is positioned to that, but I do think that individuals are, you know, as Ben said at the beginning of this is a painful time to be a human. And if you as a corporation can help activate your employees or activate your customer base or your fans so that they can be part of giving back in a relatively inexpensive way, right? Like, this wasn't a high dollar campaign. Folks needed to buy some fabric. That clearly spoke to people and is speaking to people in a huge way. And I think both of those brands are better off for that activation, and certainly our communities are.
I think that's a really important example, actually, because I know a lot of people who are listening and the people who are going to be listening to the recording they're always looking for concrete steps. Like, it's one thing for you and Nate and Ben to be really creative because you have this universe that you can pull from of examples and experience. But most businesses, as we know, are focused on their universe and their business and don't always have an opportunity to look outside. And I think here's a really concrete example of where you don't have a direct alignment between what your business does and what you think is needed out into the community. You essentially transport what your business does into getting someone else to do something for the community that you really believe in. So giving like a discount or a coupon or a credit or having a contest among your community of either employees and or outside of your employees, your client base, and asking them to do something good for the community is a really, really useful example. Like that's a huge takeaway from my perspective that I'm definitely going to use with my clients when we're struggling to come up with what else. Like that's a huge example. So thank you for that. I think one of the things that our proposition for this webinar was to really demonstrate that there is value in doing this. And I don't mean just that like, oh, I come home and I feel good about myself, which is its own huge value proposition, but that there's actually an interlacing between the feeling good aspect of doing good, but really adding value to your business in doing that. If that's how we have to convince you to do it, then we're going to make the case for that. So I actually want to pivot to you, Ben. What's the impact on revenue from being, good in a lot of ways, whether it's sustainable, whether it's being a huge donor? How does that affect revenue? Does it affect revenue? What does that do for companies?
So I think a good place to start with that question is looking at how ESG companies have really grown over the past decade. For those who don't know, ESG is environmental, social, and it's a metric for measuring, in this case, a lot of publicly traded companies. And they started to perform very well, and funds really started to emerge after the Great Recession. Now, skeptics really thought when times are troubled and when things take another downturn, the money will leave the ESG sector, right? People will return to investing in coal. They'll return to investing in a lot of the players that they're used to. In fact, the opposite has really happened since the COVID-19 crisis. And so if you look at money that was invested between January and April of 2019 versus money that was invested in the same period of 2020, the money's more than doubled in 2020. And if you look at performance of these ESG funds since COVID, again, not necessarily doing well under normal circumstances, but they are outperforming their counterparts. So the fact is that these ESG companies, the thesis holds up that these companies are the future. And investing in these companies makes sense, and having these policies make sense because at the end of the day, that's what consumers are looking for. Now, don't quote me on the investment piece of that. We're not giving investment advice. I should say that as an attorney.
Okay.
The fact is that there really has been a rise of this conscious consumer who is looking to the brand, who's doing something positive in the community. And when it comes to a company getting liquidity, whether that's through an investment from a VC or whether that is an exit opportunity, if they're looking to ultimately sell, brand loyalty and customer loyalty are really two of the metrics that a potential investor or buyer are looking at.
Yeah.
We've talked about the ESG companies that are performing well, but if you're looking to ultimately profit from your business as well, it really is a sound thing to look at these CSR ESG policies.
And I'm assuming that the really successful leaders who are looking not just downward at their own practices, but looking up and around them to see how other businesses are faring, they're taking note of this. I know we've been hearing it within the firm. What are your every other question that I get is, what are your other clients doing? What are your other clients doing? What are you advising everybody else? They don't want to be left behind. They want to know, is everyone else ahead of them? And if so, how do they catch up? And so I think it's really interesting to know the difference between who's caught up, who's behind, and then who's actually ahead of the curve, who's innovating, who's leading the charge of the leadership community. Actually, with that issue in mind, Nate, I was hoping to ask you, as we move out of what we consider to be sort of the current mire of COVID, and we're looking at the next, 12 to 24 months, that's still really COVID minded and COVID affected. How can true leaders really keep their audiences, both internally and externally, engaged, motivated? What are the visionaries doing?
I think, first of all, the single most important thing that any communicator can do is listen. And I think you have to be constantly listening in this moment in a way that, you know, my business has, in the last 15 years, it's gotten faster and faster and faster with the news cycle, with the opportunities for technology. COVID is like hyperspeed, and it's not even every day, it's every hour. It's different in some ways. And the business leaders who are succeeding in this moment are constantly like looking and understanding and trying to see where things are shaking out. With that being said, I think it's about taking the time to really develop a powerful message that resonates, and understanding, having empathy, again, this comes from listening, with what your target audience is going through, understanding how you can speak to them in a way that they're going to be able to hear it, and that's going to move them, and then building a strong communications program around that message that extends across all the different opportunities in the current environment. Whether that's launching a webinar series like we're doing right now, whether that's developing a really strong social channel, whether that's doing an advertorial partnership with a news outlet, whether that's pitching a story in a traditional way, whether that's like building a strong executive communications platform for your leader to go out and speak directly to your employees or to your customers. And it's thinking about all the different tools in your toolbox at this moment and putting them together into a coherent program that makes sense. And making sure that the people within your organizations or the consultants that are working for your organization are speaking the same language and have a shared vision. And it's got to be anchored around that really powerful message that speaks to your audience. We often say in my office, you know, the three components of an effective strategic communications program are message, audience, and objective. If you can understand what you're trying to do, who you're trying to reach, and what the message is that's going to be able to reach that person, that's how you're effective. And that's simple. But then when it gets translated into the real world and thinking about all these different tools, it's making sure that you're considering all the different options that exist, and then putting them to work.
Now, there seems to me that there are kind of two ways of doing it. One is to listen to people who are doing it or seeing how other people are doing it, and potentially being opportunistic and seeing where are the weaknesses, where can I sell right now. I think when we were talking earlier, I mentioned I had seen an ad where somebody was saying like, oh, aren't we all so stressed and frazzled right now? This was an ad on TV. And don't we all need to rest? Well, we sell very comfortable mattresses, and don't you want to rest on one of our mattresses? And I thought, oh my God, that's so tone deaf. That seemed completely missing the point of what restfulness is and not combining the two. So to me, it really brought up the issue of communicating in a really exploitative, opportunistic way versus an authentic way. And is that a common thing that audiences and the community picks up on, or is that just me being hypersensitive as a listener?
I think it's great. I mean, I often joke, to be an attorney, you have to go to law school. There's like sort of a competitive weeding process. Unfortunately, in the marketing communications field, there's less of a, and so like and not to speak ill of my field, but I see stuff like that, and I'm wondering who is the person that was employed to develop that ad and not raise the question. I think you really have to value communications expertise, and it's rooted in those simple principles, but it's rooted in a very, very deep understanding and empathy of how audiences are going to react to things, and in a set of instincts that are built over years and years of doing this work. And then that's on the one hand. On the other hand is having that knowledge of how the current ecosystem works. I often joke that like we'll get clients that are operating what we call a legacy program, which is a program that would have been great 25 years ago, but no longer is relevant to how people are communicating today. You can't have someone who's just like digital fatty, not like fat, into this kind of fad and but doesn't have a basic understanding of communications, which goes back to Aristotle, and there are basic principles that exist that you have to really understand intuitively, and having a knowledge of how the ecosystem works in order to deploy really effective strategies. And that is expensive, it requires expertise, either, probably in-house and or with a good firm that you're working with, and resources to develop really great content. But ultimately, I think the folks who make those investments, it more than pays for itself, and it's a really important thing to do to make sure you don't have those instances where you're selling the mattress ad using COVID.
Yeah.
I'll get off my soapbox now, but that just enraged me that I had to say something.
A very wrong message. Emily, I actually wanted to ask you, because you work very closely with your clients as well, on regardless of the moment we're in, really emphasizing social impact, both internally through employee engagement and externally through community engagement. If businesses take the time, and a lot of them have the time right now, to build strong social impact efforts and systems within their companies, is there going to be continued value once we're out of this and everything's back to business as normal? What is the value? Are there any examples? Is anyone doing that right now that you can speak to that has really pivoted and is going to benefit from that pivot for quite some time?
Yeah, without a question. And I think, just to kind of put us at the baseline pre-COVID again, this was already real, right? Like employees already said, millennials already said 64% of them, they weren't going to work at a place that didn't have kind of a values-based purpose function. We know that people vote with their wallets. Over 2/3 of consumers are buying things because they believe in a brand's, ethos and really trust that they're trying to do right by their community. So these things, were real before. I think that is only going to grow exponentially post-COVID. I really believe that every single company, whether it be by folks who are coming in to seek jobs in your talent pipeline, your future customer base, your future financing, the banks that you go to, I think people going 2, 3, 4, 5 years out from now are going to be asking you, what did you do during COVID to be of use? How did you treat your folks? How did you engage with the community? So number one, if you can't answer those questions, I think you're going to be running from a deficit to begin with. But moreover, I think if you're building this muscle and doing this work in a way that is authentic, that is really listening to what the community needs, has a good sense of who you are as an organization, and is answering a question that needs to be answered, if you can build that muscle in, I think you're going to be super, super ahead of the game, because we know that employees care about this. We know that customers care about this. But I think the thing that folks might not be realizing is that this is what leaders who are millennials are doing regardless. And so if you have competitors in your sector who have this baked into their leadership principles, because this is sort of who they are as a human in the world, they're going to be lapping you. And it's not to say that you need to keep up with the Joneses. I actually think that the way for this work to be special is to not worry about what other people are doing and to figure out how to be your best you. But I think gone are the days where folks just didn't have to think about this. That 90% number, going back to when Corona hit, 90% of consumers saying businesses need to show up right now. If that's not an indicator, I don't know what is, for what the next decade and beyond is going to require of folks. And I think you asked for an example. There are a bunch that come to mind, but I look at a place like Sweet Green, which is a salad company. They are, millennial led, really thinking about who they are as an organization, how they treat their folks, what kind of food they're putting into the world. And that was already sort of the train that they were on. And COVID happened and they said, okay, number one, we're going to go in and help provide food for essential healthcare workers. Great. That eclipsed their ability to service that model. And so they opened it up to their customer base and said, hey, if folks want to join in, we're feeding people, donations welcome. And they worked with nonprofits to make that happen. Super. And then they pushed the needle further and they said, what do communities need right now? And this kind of goes back to that social impact piece, not needing to necessarily cost anything. And they realized that people were looking for comfort food and looking to feel like they could sit around a table, eat something that was healthy, but also something that was really satisfying. And going into COVID, they made salads, and salads aren't exactly like heartwarming, like nourishment food, right? And so they expedited a project that they had called Plates that was all about figuring out how to serve people a main, a green, and have it be really yummy and satisfying and fulfilling. And that's also what they're bringing to healthcare workers and nourishing communities. And so I think just looking at that business as an example that's really already had this muscle, made it even bigger. And you see, I should add, you see on social media and you see in the press how much love they're getting and how much customer loyalty they're getting for these changes. That is something that's going to carry them through COVID. And we could take up the next hour with examples like these, but it's really from companies big to small, private to public, that you see this value already paying dividends, and that's only going to grow.
Thank you. No, I think that's really important. And I think it's like you said, this is something that, at least in the example that you gave, it sounds like they had already been brainstorming internally. So it's something that starts from within the business. You don't have to wait for somebody outside the company to really lead this charge. I think you can put together teams within the company. You don't have to necessarily hire a new employee or a new executive. You can start brainstorming within your company, but somebody should be charged with this as an aspect of their job. Whoever's already there should be aware, because I think one of the things that, and we had talked about this before, is it's nice to talk about it and it's nice to read about it and it's nice to bask in another company's success and go, oh, we could do that. But unless someone is actually tasked with being in charge of that process and then putting together a team or putting together action items and scheduling those, making them a reality, it's not going to happen, and it's going to just stay a good idea.
Yeah.
So to really implement it and to make it real and to really get value out of it, I actually was hoping, Ben, since we started with you and your touch points with a lot of different businesses in the community, I thought maybe we could wrap up with you and you could tell us a little bit about how do you put together a team? Who should be on this team? How do you develop this team of people who are helping you come up with and create value out of doing good?
A great question. So I think to begin with, you touched on this earlier, Karina. One of the things that may need to happen in some companies is really breaking the traditional hierarchy where certain decisions are only being made in the C-suite. And by democratizing the employee base and allowing good ideas to rise to the top, that is certainly one way that this can be achieved. Another thing that comes to mind is the idea of removing some of the silos that traditionally occur in these organizations as between advisors. So on this call, I mean, we have, or on this panel, we have a communications specialist, a CSR specialist, an attorney. We may not necessarily communicate traditionally with some of our clients, even if there is an overlapping client that we all share. But going forward, I think that is certainly something that could change. One, to allow more creative solutions to come to the forefront. And two, selfishly, I mean, from our perspective, the better that we know your business, the more able we are to serve you and come up with creative solutions.
Okay, I agree. Well, this was very fascinating for me, so I'm very excited. Thank you guys. It's like you said, Emily, I think we could probably spend hours and hours more on this, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I promised that we would make sure that we ended the call on time, and I think we've actually built in a 5-minute cushion, so I am hoping you will use the 5-minute cushion to really brainstorm and come up with one good thing you could do this week. One little tiny little 5-minute thing, even if it means sending an email to somebody and telling them you appreciate what they've done. Okay? All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.